All right, welcome back to part 4 of the Great Depression. So today, all we're studying is the Great Depression. So if you leave here understanding the Great Depression, check. We've done well. In the past, sometimes I take 2 to 3 days on the Great Depression. Obviously, now we have 2 classes every day. So if you feel like we're not really accomplishing a lot here today, no, we are covering 2 days' work for sure. So the last bit of the Great Depression that we need to cover is the Great Depression in Canada. And, obviously as Canadians, we should be interested in the story because this is our story, this is our history. Having said that, I need to jump to the chase and say, how will you be assessed on this? So on the diploma exam, the one that all of you are going to opt to write for sure, you might see it on the multiple choice. You might see a reference to labor strife on the multiple choice. So there's something called the On to Ottawa track. That comes up a lot. The On to Ottawa track comes up on multiple choice a lot. So we'll have to take note of that. We also have seen some references to the growth of the CCF that becomes the NDP. So we have some sources in here that will wrestle with that as well. And you should be aware of the Prime Minister change between Prime Minister Bennett and the Liberals with Mackenzie King coming back into power in 1935. So those are kind of the big pictures of what we see. Sometimes students will use it on their essay, but most talk about the United States in the essay. So how will you be tested on this? To some extent on the multiple choice. So we have some good sources to play with here. Here's the Depression era politics in Canada. On December 1934, on December something 1934, a crowd of 17,000 people jammed into Toronto Maple Leafs garden, not to watch the Leafs obviously, to listen to a speech by Tim Buck, the leader of the Canadian Communist Party. So during the Great Depression in Canada, like we saw in the United States, some people became so disillusioned? No, what word am I trying to say? Disillusioned with liberalism, that they end up being tempted to go all the way to non-liberalism, all the way to communism. And we're seeing 17,000 people jammed in to watch a speaker, Tim Buck, talk about communism. Another 8,000 people were turned away because there wasn't enough standing room. At one end of the arena, behind the platform used by speakers, was a large portrait of Joseph Stalin. So how desperate were we? Communism was growing in Canada. In 1933, in Blairmore, Alberta, they elected a town council made up entirely of members of the Communist Party. So just as an aside, I put that in there to give you some frame of reference of how desperate people were, how disillusioned they were. So perhaps the most famous of radicalism during the 1930s in Canada, though, was the On to Ottawa and the Regina Riot, both in 1935. The On to Ottawa track, was started by a group of nearly 1,000 unemployed workers in British Columbia who decided to take their grievances directly to the Prime Minister in Ottawa. How are they going to get to Ottawa? Well, they're going to jump on the train. They're going to jump on the train, ride the train on to Ottawa. And as the train would stop in other towns, more and more people would jump on the train. So by the time they got to Regina, about 1,800 trekkers were in Regina, and they were stopped by the RCMP. The trek was halted by the RCMP in Regina, and a riot broke out. And in the riot, a member of the Regina police was killed. So it was a violent riot between the workers who were disillusioned because they felt the government wasn't doing enough for them. They felt that Prime Minister Bennett wasn't doing enough for them. So they thought that if they jumped on the train and took their protest or grievances on to Ottawa, then they could try to get Ottawa's attention. Ottawa was a long ways away from British Columbia. And they'd hoped that if they could see him in person, they could take their grievances to him. We also saw a coal miner strike in Esteban in Saskatchewan. Now please keep in mind that this isn't necessarily the first major strike here in Western Canada, that even just in the wake of World War I, in 1919, there was a general strike in Winnipeg. So we kind of gave you a false impression this morning that the 1920s was this time of great prosperity. We didn't really tell you that in between the end of the First World War and the 1920s, there was some economic difficulty. Transitioning from a war economy back to a consumer economy, absorbing hundreds of thousands of soldiers back into the workforce was a difficult process. And in the city of Winnipeg, some of the soldiers that came back, they didn't return back to the life that had been promised to them. Some of their jobs were not waiting for them. So this led to a lot of frustration that ended up escalating into the general strike, the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. When you take the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 and the Esteban coal miner strike of 1931, you take in the Ottawa track, the Regina Riot, the fact that communists are being elected in Blairmore, the fact that thousands are coming out to listen to Tim Buck speak about communism as the solution to their problems, this in and of itself should be enough to convince you that Canadians were looking for a new relationship with their government. They wanted liberalism to evolve from classic, hands-off, to modern, hands-on. Some mix of socialism. We needed relief, recovery, and reform, like what was being delivered in FDR's America. So Canada's a little bit behind America here. Often we look at Canada and America today and we think that Canada is more socialist than America, and we are. We have more socialized healthcare. But in the 1930s, the United States actually got the lead on us. 1933 New Deal, this is 1935, and we're still trying to get our government's attention and saying we need help over here. So we're actually a couple years behind them. So there's a period of time in the 1930s that economically Canada was further to the right than America. And that's not usually how the story has been. So we also see the growth of Canadians demanding a new relationship with their government, and they looked at the existing parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, and they didn't really see a party that had a tent big enough to fit their grievances. So then we see the growth of new parties, new platforms, as the will of the people had to be expressed in new ways. So I'm just going to skim through some of this stuff for a second, and we're going to go down to that idea. So here, this cartoon, 1933, is being critical that the government's not providing enough. 1933, Toronto, these people look like they need to be fed. This is an empty bowl of food. Government's saying, you know what, I'll provide some relief, but it's just a little drop. This cartoonist is being critical, saying the government's not doing enough relief. So then we had the Ottawa track and the Regina Riot, 1935. This is a picture of the riot. So you could end up getting a photograph like this in an A1 where you have to look at it and say, okay, what is the sign saying? What is it that they want? And that'll give you some clues as to what's happening. Here you have another criticism of Bennett, the Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, that seems to be not giving much to help the poor, but seems to be providing lots of wealth for his fellow rich people. So unemployment is steadily increasing in Canada. The young workers can expect nothing for the $20 million that is to be expended as a means of solving the unemployment problem. Some lousy soup and the mission house will be the lot of the unemployed young workers unless we organize the fight for work or full maintenance. So you can see the growing radicalization and the call for perhaps some violence. So this is Bennett saying unemployment, I promise an end to unemployment, and but he's also suggesting that unemployment is a problem that is behind us, that by the time of the federal election in 35 it's not really an issue. And this cartoonist is suggesting unemployment is such a big issue that it's going to cost him the election. So when Bennett loses the election because he hasn't done enough to deal with unemployment, the video earlier said it was 30% in Canada, so even worse here than the US, then we're going to re-elect the Liberals who had been in power before Bennett, and Mackenzie King will introduce his New Deal, his Keynesian economics. And that's what we see here. Robert Bennett has been stepping all over the Canadian citizens with broken promises. Mackenzie King is saying, hey, can I cut in? So this is the current Prime Minister, this is the previous guy, and he's saying, you know what, maybe I should be Prime Minister again. And the Canadian citizens are like, my savior, I need you. So this is him saying capitalism's the way to go, and this is Mackenzie King realizing that we need modern liberalism. Government needs to play a role here. So some would suggest that the problem in Canada was worse than it had to be because the Bennett government was corrupted by their connections to the capitalists, and they're ignoring the problems that farmers and other laborers were trying to get, on the docket, the attention of government. So some of the abuses of the capitalist systems, like low wages and sweatshops and unfair prices, were being allowed because Bennett was connected, in a corrupting way with business. So here's that cartoon about the growth of a new party. So the CCF becomes the NDP. And the argument being made in 1933 is there's no party big enough for all the problems Canada's facing. We have the need to deal with profit sharing. We need to deal with interest charges. We need to respond to the problem of taxation, and insurance is too cheap. Insurance is too expensive. We need to deal with poverty. We need to work on higher wages and work for all. And maybe we need to nationalize banks. And we need to respond to the debt problems. Many of these problems were dealt with in America with the New Deal, but in 1933 Canada, under R.B. Bennett, he hasn't been dealing with them. So because he hasn't been dealing with them, it leads to the growth of a new political party that is today's NDP. And what is the NDP? It's Canada's left-wing party. It's Canada's party that is most collectivist. It's Canada's party that is most in favor of positive freedom through government. So if you are an impoverished Canadian struggling with poverty that needs government, you should vote for the NDP. If you're a wealthy Canadian, then you might have economic reasons to not vote for the NDP. So that's the quick story of the situation in Canada. So you may have the idea of the growth of the new party, the CCF, you may see that. You may have the idea that Bennett was connected to the flaws of classic economic liberalism, things like low wages and sweatshops and unfair prices, and he was ignoring that Bennett ignored it because he was a champion of capitalism. You may get a source that looks at the idea that King became the savior of the American people, the Canadian people, by cutting in the 1935 election and his liberals beating Bennett's conservatives. That the reason why that he beat the conservatives was that the conservatives didn't deal with the unemployment problem because they felt that capitalism would provide a solution. It didn't. It looked like, at least to the poor, that Bennett was favoring the rich. There's a lot of violence, including most famously the Regina riots as a response of the On to Ottawa track that was stopped in Regina by the RCMP. And again, the Bennett government is criticized for not doing enough. So much so that we have here's the speeches about the growth of the CCF, but we also had others that went so far as starting to want communism. And that's the story of the Great Depression in Canada.